everybody, welcome back. So our next session is called Forming New Relationships Between Humans and Earth. And the first person we're going to be hearing from, can people hear me? Okay. The first person we're going to be hearing from is Malcolm Gore, who is getting his master's in the Leadership for Sustainability program. And his presentation is called Efficient Agriculture, Nature as a Model.
Thanks, Emma, and thank you everyone else for being here today. So my presentation is on efficient agriculture or efficiency in agriculture, and let's go ahead and get started. So first question is, what is efficiency? To be efficient in the current society is considered a really high value. It's like an inherent good for all of us. But really, what do we mean by that? The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines efficiency as productive of desired effects, and especially productive without waste. We'll be coming back to this definition later. In neoclassical economics, there are really two kinds of type of efficiency, which are pretty similar. Allocative efficiency, which is production represents consumer preferences. Basically, producers will produce what the consumers want. And this is achieved when scarce resources are put to the use that generates the most monetary value. So for example, using rare metals to create high-end electronics equals great monetary value. There's also Carido efficiency, which is the idea that the end result of free and voluntary exchange is that no further trading will make one person better off without making someone else worse off. There's a lot of assumptions to this model, and there's three kind of ideas behind it, but the big one is that governments can create Carido efficiency by adjusting prices. The big problem that I have personally with this idea is that the idea of better off and worse off are kind of relative terms, and $100 to a millionaire is a lot different than $100 to a subsistence farmer, for example. In all of these definitions, though, well, except for the Merriam-Webster, efficiency is kind of measured by monetary value. Even when we think of workers in society, an efficient worker is someone who gets more work done per hour or per month than an inefficient worker. So in agriculture, Carido efficiency does not really work because there's a lot of other factors, a lot of externalities and inputs that make the system really complex. Traditionally, the USDA has measured agricultural productivity as the ratio of outputs to inputs. And the total factor productivity accounts for all the diverse inputs used in agriculture. Those are feed and seed, energy, fertilizer and lime, pesticides, purchased services, and other. All of these are given a monetary value because they claim that it's too difficult to measure production by weight due to the different densities of foodstuffs. So everything is measured based on the value that it creates. An alternative measurement in agriculture is called energy returns on investment. This was first proposed by John and Carol Steinhardt in 1974. And it kind of sees agriculture as a system of energy transformation. The energy from the sun goes to the food, goes to our bodies. All of the energy is consumed that way. The problem with this is it's hard to standardize because there's just different crops on all different farms and everything. You have to do it for each separate farm that you measure. But it does confront internal energy loops in farm systems, such as using livestock manure to fertilize crops. Down here, you can see the two equations for both of them. And you can see that in EROI, the biomass reused is with the external inputs over beneath the final produce. So that is accounted for where it is not in the traditional TFP model. Here we have two graphs that kind of show these two ideas and how they've both increased over the last 100 years, really. So on the right, we have energy returns on investment. which shows up calories of energy subsidy for 1 calorie of food output. You can see that range-fed beef is about 20 times less intensive than feedlot beef, and low-intensity corn is half of high-intensity corn. So the amount of energy put into producing those things is different. On the other hand, we have output increasing. This is what the USDA loves to talk about, how agricultural output has increased without any of the inputs increasing at all. Very efficient. The problem with that is that there are no costs. So in nature, efficiency is not really about maximization, it's more about optimization. If you think of a frog and tadpole, a lot of those tadpoles are not going to reach maturity and reproduce. But, you know, we all learned about the food chain system in middle school science, where all of the resources, all of the nutrients from every animal is recycled back into the system. In the EROI model, you can see that that same concept is kind of used with the sun creating nutrients or energy, and that's getting all recycled back into the farmland. So back to the question of what are the desired effects of agriculture? What is productivity? Dilbert here reminds me of farmers in the sense that they have quadrupled their output, but have not necessarily seen a lot of monetary gains for that. Overproduction is kind of the MO of a lot of farms, and this green revolution, which has fed the world, or not really, has also had a lot of hidden costs. These successes of the green revolution on the left are compared to their hidden costs on the right. So I'm going to talk now about 3 inefficiencies embedded in the agricultural systems. The first one is waste. It's kind of shocking to learn about this, but 24% of the food that is grown is only consumed as food. And 44% of that matter is lost prior to human consumption. So this graph kind of shows that with the net primary productivity of grassland and cropland on the left with green and yellow, and all of the gray is all of the waste before it gets to the consumers on the far right. And there's the other thing is that a huge amount of food is grown for crop and ethanol use, so not even for human consumption. Up to 36% of all crops in the world go to animal feed, and about 10% go to ethanol. The main reason for this waste is the supply chain. Food is engineered for trucks and distribution, not for consumption. Another big problem is subsidies. 80%, about $500 billion was given to the last farm bill. The next one's coming up in September. 80% of that goes to SNAP. And well, that is, losses from food waste could cover the entire cost of SNAP. The other big thing is crop insurance, or premiums are tied to global commodity prices. And farmers are kind of obligated to grow these huge staple crops. New Zealand actually eliminated subsidies in the 90s, and they have seen an increase in the amount of farmers in their country. Elimination is kind of drastic, but there's definitely should be some sort of changes to the system. And lastly, we have the idea just of cereals. Maize, wheat, and rice account for 50% of all food calories consumed in the world. All of them lack the essential amino acids for proper nutrition. All of these annual grasses developed separately in cradles of civilization for the agricultural revolution. Obviously, there are benefits to them, but they are annual grasses, which means that they cannot compete with perennials, and they're designed to take over floodplain areas. So,
Malcolm, you got about a minute to wrap up.
So they're not necessarily best designed for a place like maybe the grasslands of Canada. This chart shows the water used for rice and wheat versus all of the other crops in the world. So moving on, agroecology has kind of solutions to all of these problems, as I've described. If you don't know about agroecology, it's a great thing to research. It's defined as the application of ecological concepts and principles to the design and management of sustainable agroecosystems. Basically, it models food production on natural processes and it's specific to each farm. I kind of went through the three main problems. It solves waste by being hyper-local. It solves subsidies by being more resilient and reducing the need for crop insurance. Maybe not solves, but ameliorates the problems. And it's also very diverse and helps, reduce monocultures and all of the problems that come with monocultures. The question we want to be asking ourselves, efficiency, is it about maximization of profit or optimization of our resources? And after 10,000 years, why are we still forcing the same crops to grow in suboptimal locations? So and just some recommendations.
Sorry, it's my fault.
You can read them yourself along with the Calvin and Hobbes comic. Thank you everyone for listening. That went by pretty fast.
Awesome, thank you so much. Questions?
We have the comment from Kate that New Zealand that they've switched to beef and dairy from sheep, which was not optimal for their land, relating to the last thing you said. And this was to feed the Chinese new market for beef and milk.
I did not hear about that, but that does make sense. And I do know that beef is easier to produce on a smaller scale than perhaps sheep, where a lot of sheep will die off every year. So that might have been one of the reasons for smaller farmers or bigger farmers doing that switch.
We've got a question from Charles. Can agroecology feed 7 million people?
That's a great question. And honestly, we don't know. But I kind of see it as in league with traditional forms of agriculture, industrial agriculture. We don't necessarily, if half of the food that we are producing is being wasted, why not give something else a chance? Agroecology is definitely more local and it requires a bit more labor and knowledge intensive stuff. So it's harder to get off the ground and you can't necessarily like export the model to everything, but it does provide a huge opportunity for food to be grown in bioregions. So food, in my case in Virginia, would be grown in Virginia that is best suited for Virginia. And I also, last thing I want to say about that is that actually medium and small sized farms produce more food for the people eat than the big, large farms, which usually just produce grains.
All right, cool. Thanks, Malcolm. If there are no other questions, we can move on to Eva Kinnebrew. She's a PhD student in the Natural Resource Program at the Rubenstein School of Environmental Studies. And her talk is called Human Biodiversity Relationships in Cuban Agriculture.
Great. All right. Hi, everyone. My name's Eva Kinnebrew, and as Emma remarked, my talk is called, there we go, Human Nature Connections in Cuban Agriculture. So this talk centers around a key moment in Cuba's recent history, which is the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So I want to start off by describing the impact of this event on Cuba's agricultural sector and food systems more broadly. Between the 1950s, hi, and 1991, Cuba had a strong trade relationship with the Soviet Union, from which it had access to food, fuel, and agricultural inputs like fertilizer and pesticides. This trade agreement heavily influenced agriculture and especially supported industrial agriculture. However, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba lost a huge percent of its imports, like fertilizer, which had a huge impact on agricultural productivity. The immediate result of this collapse was a production crisis during which a lot of farms were abandoned, And this, along with the loss of food imports, created food shortages and a period of prolonged extreme hunger lasting throughout the 90s, and during which Cubans lost an average of 20 pounds. This period is known very tongue-in-cheek as the special period. So what came from that hardship, however, is quite remarkable. Without agricultural inputs, Cubans turned to agroecology, as Malcolm talked about earlier, to increase agricultural production and feed their population without those inputs. Their efforts have been impressively successful, and today Cuba is one of the leaders in agroecology. So this brings me to my research question, which is, how did the collapse of the Soviet Union and the resultant food system shape human-nature connections? And so I was lucky enough to travel to Cuba this March and meet with some urban and rural farmers to answer this question. And the conversations that I had with those farmers are the backbone of this presentation. Before I go any further, I want to define human-nature connection, or how I use in this presentation, which is the feeling and acknowledgement that nature contributes to or or is inherent to oneself or human being in general. So this can take form in a number of ways, such as gratitude and appreciation for nature, and more pertinent to this presentation, farmers understanding that biological diversity can be an asset. And I think this topic is so interesting because, first of all, we are a part of nature. We're dependent on it for our survival. And yet a lot of our behavior often suggests that we don't grasp this concept. In general, it seems like Western culture is largely separated from nature. Studying neoclassical economics and the assumptions that it's built on, this gap between humans and nature becomes quite obvious. It's sort of a chicken and the egg question. Is neoclassical economics a symptom of human nature separation, or is it the creator of? And it's likely both. I'm also really interested in this topic because I think that the separation of humans and nature has catalyzed and made way for the destruction of natural ecosystems worldwide. Repairing this relationship, I think, is one of the most effective ways that we can conserve the planet, and therefore should be one of the main tenets of the Ecozoic. So the first theme that I want to talk about in relation to Cuba and human-nature relationships is the idea of excess and limitation in economies, and how this works to shape our understanding of the natural world. So living in a global economy and in a first world country, I've never really strongly felt a lack of resources. Putting aside financial considerations, if I want a product, it's almost always accessible to me. The consequence of this is the perception that there is an overabundance of resources, which of course is a fallacy. We know that resources are limited, and even renewable resources have their limitations. Again, however, excessive, ever-flowing economies hides this truth from us. They can lead us as consumers to make purchasing choices that are bad for the environment because we don't realize that our products come from the environment at all. They come from an amorphous, godlike economy that seems to be busting at its seams with products. The flip side of that, of course, is a limited economy, which, as I discussed during the special period and very much to an extent now, Cuba experiences. To reiterate an earlier point, I've shown some maps here that just demonstrate the extent of agricultural abandonment in a region of Matanzas, Cuba between 1985 and 2012. So as a consequence of this, again, there were food shortages which manifested in physical suffering. So this reality is quite humbling, to feel hunger and to realize that that suffering is a product of the land not producing. In this case, the dependence of humans on natural systems becomes quite clear. Our nourishment, well-being, and ability to take care of our children is connected to and hinges on the well-being of the environment. And from this logic follows that we are connected to the environment. So again, this realization of human nature connectedness is emboldened in the conscious minds during times of shortages. I also think that this period has demonstrated an important point, which is that human systems tend to be volatile and fallible. The godlike economy doesn't seem so godlike when you and your children have to skip meals for years. Thus breeds a sense of humility. Furthermore, I think there's something to be said for the power of memory, and especially in relation to traumatic events like the special period. These memories live deeply in those who experienced it and can motivate and justify behaviors for a long time afterwards. So even though my trip to Cuba happened 20 years after the special period, the stress and a sense of security remain for those who experienced it. So one farmer summed this period up pretty well by saying, Cuba went to bed rich and woke up poor, and then agroecology arrived. So as noted, the outcome of the special period was the abandonment of a lot of industrial agriculture and the subsequent creation of community-oriented small farms. As well, with a shortage of fertilizer and pesticides, farmers had to use agroecology and biodiversity to overcome limitations. While in Cuba, I visited 3 farms, and at each place was struck not only by the amount of crop diversity, but by the amount of knowledge that farmers had of their crop systems and the land in general. So for example, Cuban soil is generally finely textured and poor at retaining nutrients. And whereas industrial farmers might keep feeding the crops fertilizers to reconcile this problem, Cuban farmers must take more natural, holistic approaches. To do this, they must get to know the farming system in a more intimate and thorough way. And they develop an almost scientific knowledge of the ecosystem. And indeed, the farmers that I spoke with exhibited this. They had an exhaustive knowledge of the cropping systems. Vermiculture, like this photo shows, is one example. So this is a sort of composting process in which worms break down organic matter and create a very nutrient-rich product that can be used like a fertilizer. On the bottom of this slide, I have a quote by one of the farmers. We try to produce many jungles in the farm. And I love this quote because it demonstrates an acknowledgement that a farm is a natural system and that in a sense it should be modeled like a jungle to achieve health and sustainability of the system. So I'm next going to talk about local food systems and how they can mediate the human-nature connection. So I want to start off this section by noting that as consumers, I think that food, which we need, we love, we identify with, has the potential to be one of the strongest ties that we have to nature. Understanding and really internalizing this, however, is difficult in a global economy. I can go to Trader Joe's and buy a sandwich that has ingredients from 6 different countries. And when I'm eating this sandwich, it's very hard to reflect on the fact that this food that I'm eating has come from all those different environments. Out of sight, out of mind. My allegiances are sooner directed at Trader Joe's than Costa Rica for delivering me the food. In Cuba, however, a local food system changes this dynamic. For most of their food, for a lot of their food, especially fruits and vegetables, Cubans may know exactly where their food came from. Even more with farmers markets, consumers interact directly with the farmers and may even go onto the farm to buy the food. So for example, there's a huge difference when in the psyche of consumers who buy their coffee from Starbucks versus those who buy it from the coffee producer herself and can actually see the coffee plants while making the purchase. And then there's meat products, which I think is a part of the food system whose often dirty reality is hidden from consumers and also which consumers very conveniently shun from their minds. So on this slide, I have some photos from a rural farm in Cuba where the pigs are raised and cared for from birth. And so I think this method is just extraordinary and completely changes the psychological associations that we have when we eat meat. So these local food systems create a lot more room for consumers to feel a sense of gratitude and appreciation to the farmers, the land, and the animals. And I argue that this results in the Cubans feeling more connected with their nature and even identifying it, which I think ultimately makes them more likely to conserve it. So to wrap up, I'll note again that Cuba's unique history, and especially experiencing the special period, and the local economy that emerged from that period have changed Cuban food systems in a way that brings consumers closer to nature. An important question, though, is whether this change is preferred by Cubans, and if given access to the global market again, whether Cubans would opt to keep food systems the way they are now or to revert back to a more industrial system. As well, I'm really interested to know how food systems and worldviews will change once the memory of the special period fades. So this makes the future of Cuba's food system and also their connection to nature quite uncertain. Thanks.
All right.
So we've got a question from Eli Lazarus saying that Cuba's situation was an enforced restriction to fossil fuels and global trade, plus command and control political structure. What is or isn't transferable to the rest of the world about the positive outcomes of the Cuban situation?
Yeah, definitely. And I try to get to this in that last point. Like, perhaps, in the presentation, it may seem like I'm romanticizing the situation that they are in now, but they, to a large extent, they did not choose their economy to look like what it does now. And so in terms of what we can glean from this example, I think that local food systems in general, like Malcolm talked about, can be a great gateway for us reconnecting with nature and making more ecological decisions as we in our food systems and as we conduct agriculture.
Thanks. Charles has a question saying that are agro-producers monitored by the state, or are they closely followed by the institutions that finance them, or are they free? I don't know if they are financed in that sense.
I think it depends. So land ownership changed a lot after the Soviet Union collapsed. And to me, it seems like a large extent, or a lot of the rural farms at least, are pretty free to conduct agriculture in a way that is almost like subsistence agriculture, that they're growing food for themselves and for their community. And I don't know, I don't think that they have to report that to the government. There are still, of course, industrial farms that are state-owned. And I think in terms of land ownership, there are some caveats, like the government owns the land, but the farmers who work the land are allowed to decide management. Yeah.
It occurs to me that though it wasn't by choice for Cuba, given what we know about the effects of climate change on agriculture worldwide, like that is the climate change is bad for agriculture worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, that we could see a similar special period in a lot of places in the world, especially the places in the world that don't have tons of purchasing power. And I'm wondering if that was something that you're thinking about during your research about, like, okay, so how people react to that. But what's troubling for me is that according to the Cuban government, something like 80% of their food is imported today. And I don't know if that's just the ration system or how they're calculating that. I got that from somebody else, Bennett, who did his master's in plant soil sciences. He studied part of his research in Cuba also. But this connection to nature comes from like urban fruits and veggies and stuff, but if the bulk of their calories are coming from elsewhere still, like maybe they didn't fix themselves up here.
So yeah, that's interesting. I think that also, so in my mind of the World Bank and like Cuba's databases related to food, I've gotten like mixed answers about imports and exports from Cuba. But I think a point is that there's a lot of untracked food. And so, yeah, perhaps Cubans do import a lot of rice, for example, and funnily enough, sugar, even though Cuba is like a huge producer of sugar, a lot of the farmers are not so happy because the good quality sugar that they produce is exported out, and they import like bad sugar from Brazil. So yeah, it may be that 80% of the government-tracked food is coming from external sources, but I don't think that takes into account a lot of these subsistence farms or even farmers markets, because some of these like farmers markets are like kind of like black market, like not just like not managed by the government, I guess.
Cool. That's all the time we have for questions. Next, we have Ben Collins, who's getting his PhD in the Economics for the Anthropocene program at McGill. He's talking to us about mining metals and minerals.
All right, is that working now? Did I figure that problem out with the sharing of the screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Awesome. We're getting some feedback. All right, we're all good. Okay. So hello everyone. Saw my notes earlier, but thank you very much for the introduction. I'm here at McGill with a few of us. I'm a PhD student in the Economics for the Anthropocene program. I'm going to be talking to you today about a subject that is of great interest to me. It's exploring what our relationship with metals and mining and what it should look like. So my presentation's title is Mining, Metals, and Minerals in the Ecozoic, Thomas Berry's Ecozoic, and I'll be talking about that. Okay, where are we now? We are frozen. Oh boy. We have some issues here.
Now you have to change it on your second disk.
I have to change
your
it.
original disk.
Okay, I see. We got it. Boom. Okay. Figured it out. Thank you very much. So the overall framework for my discussion will be provide an assessment of our current state, kind of discuss do we need metals or minerals, ask some key questions going forward into the Ecozoic, and provide some factors for our analysis going forward to the Ecozoic and my final thoughts. Humans and mine materials have always been inextricably linked, from the first stone tools to our empires, first empires backed by resources of bronze, steel, and gold. There's a saying that's used in the mining industry, which is used to a term of keep on mining, but I think it's quite appropriate to understand how tied we are with metals and minerals, as it's if it's not grown, it's mined, and it's source unknown. It's said quite a bit. As we push towards more green technologies, those have a lot of mine materials as well. Solar energy, wind energy have a lot of need for rare earth minerals, and even agriculture, as we were discussing today, has a considerable need for mining of potassium, phosphorus. And so if you're reflecting on the sandwich as we were reflecting earlier, please think of the mine materials that go into that as well. Well, the problem with mining is our history with metals and mining is really not the best. It's substandard, environmentally negligent, soil degradation, water contamination, acid rock drainage, greenhouse gas emissions, and ecosystem devastation are just to name the few of the impacts of mining. Local communities are extremely affected by these impacts. And so going forward, it's not clear how we can use metals or non-renewables in a sustainable way. I wanted to show a photo of a mine in the Yukon Territory, which kind of gives an example of what mining can be like. It was lead zinc mine that operated for 15 years, and it's been in closure and reclamation, meaning they've been cleaning it up for the last 20 years. And still they have about $1 billion of work left to do to bring it back to some kind of safe state, quotation, safe state for the environment. So with that, what my questions are, what should our relationships with metals look like while ensuring we have a mutually beneficial relationship with nature? And so how should we make decisions and analyze our relationship with metals while moving towards a more sustainable lifestyle? From that, I've kind of looked at three very high level scenarios, which I will then analyze. So the first one, do we leave to current market and regulatory systems? Do we repurpose supply to sustainable outcomes, limit demand? Do we stop mining altogether, recycle everything, repurpose everything? So I've looked at it through my reading of some ecological economic scholars and my own thoughts. I have 4 ways we can analyze or look at our metal usage or our metal decisions, and I'll go through each one of them. So first one, ecological thresholds on both a local and global scale. Vela, Almeida, Brooks, and Kosoi discussed this in one of their articles. They say our mineral extraction needs to be regulated to focus on the scale of use of funds, that's funds performing life-supporting processes, and the rate of ensuing waste production, meaning respect the global and local limits for pollution, waste, water usage, land use changes, dust, wildlife impacts, to name a few. From this, there can be different viewpoints of what these thresholds are or how we can manage these commons, these common pool resources. Ostrom, as we discussed quite a bit, provides a good discussion of this. My second point is the ends and means of this mined material. What are we using it for? Is it useful for society? Why do we open up major mines for gold, for diamonds? Is it worth the cost? Does it put us on a trajectory towards the Ecozoic? I wanted to provide a quote here from Georgescu Rogan. There can be no doubt about it. Any use of natural resources for the satisfaction of non-vital needs means a smaller quantity of life in the future. If we understand well the problem, the best use of our iron resources to produce plows or harrows as they're needed, not Rolls Royce, not even agricultural tractors. Number 3, the ends and means, what the mine material is, oh, sorry, wait, I've lost it. So number 3, the energy required to have or make metals, respecting the thermodynamic laws. For all decisions on metals, we are limited by energy. Energy dictates our scarcity of our metal decisions. How much energy does it take for mining versus recycling versus repurposing, and understanding that this energy we use causes pollution, thermal pollution. And entropy laws play a key factor. Resources are low entropy matter energy that will eventually break down, distort, and then become less useful. As we attempt to, so a key point on recycling is, as we attempt to recycle more and more of our produced goods, we will reach the point of diminishing returns. The energy expenditure alone will give a rise to ruinous amounts of waste heat or thermal pollution. On the other hand, if we recycle too small of our produced goods, then non-thermal pollution and resource depletion become a severe problem. And finally, the stock's size and durability. Asking the question, how much of the stock do we have? How long does it last when if we take it out? What's its ability to be reused and recycled? Orthodox economists recognize particular resources are limited, but not scarcity of resources in general. Absolute limits are absent from our conventional economic thinking. So returning back to the scenarios, leave to current market and regulatory systems. Unfortunately, we'll reach absolute limits, absolute scarcity, and planetary ecological thresholds. Okay, so we repurpose supply to sustainable outcomes and limit demand. How do we decide what outcomes are sustainable? Does a minimal throughput exist that respects ecological thresholds? Do we still just end up with absolute scarcity afterwards? So number 3, no more mining, recycle everything, repurpose everything. Is impossible to recycle materials with 100% completeness. There's issues in terms of energy to recycle these purpose and causes thermal pollution. So my final thoughts are our demand for metals and our rate of consumption is increasing. Energy required per unit of metal is also increasing, thus having larger and larger impacts on our environment. We need a major shift of consumption and lifestyle values needed for the Ecozoic age. This shift requires the understanding of our upstream impact of as metal users, reflecting on this sandwich I reflected on earlier, and how we should limit our metal usage going forward. Thank you very much. Hold on.
Questions?
Okay. You guys want to turn your mics on?
Oh, the chat box went away.
I can ask one if you're lost.
Okay, yeah.
Kate asks, do we want to go beyond sustainable to I can never say this word, regenerative?
Regenerative. The problem with regenerative for a lot of mined materials is it's not in our human life scale. They do regenerate, but over a long period of time. So I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Does anyone in the room have questions? Kate clarified it's for phosphorus, nitrogen, and potassium in our time scale. That was a comment.
I'm not completely familiar with the, honestly, the technological aspects of recycling and mining and regenerating. I guess the mine materials are potassium and phosphate. Back to.
Hey,
We have a question from, oh.
No, go ahead. I mean, let them go. And then just okay.
okay. All right, sorry. We're having major mic problems here at UVM. Ben, this is John. I got a quick question for you. I know you reviewed the sort of doom and gloom of Krzyzewski-Rochain a bit. The challenge, right, with something like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, et cetera, is the farther they get sort of downstream, right, into these very diffuse forms, the more energy that it's required to kind of recollect them. I mean, they don't go away, but they become harder and harder to collect. I mean, in your research, have you found ways to kind of go farther upstream to help to build on Kate's question, build a more regenerative, restorative relationship with minerals?
I guess so I haven't looked specifically in depth at potassium and phosphate. I guess so that it brings back to energy. It's just it's a question of where is the best place to spend our energy to bring it back to a useful state. It's hard to say where exactly that comes from for each mine material you have.
Well, your question on kind of what its use is seems to be pretty key, right? If we're using it for frivolous things versus essential things, that's going to help determine, I guess, our relationship with metals and energy going forward.
So I guess, yeah, for some material, for things like for agriculture, we would be willing to spend more energy for it because it is more useful for society than as say, recycling gold for more jewelry. That would be my opinion. We got a question here in McGill.
Yeah, it's Peter Brown. Yes, I wondered what your reaction is to the idea of trying to alleviate some of these problems by family planning or some way of just not only reducing the consumption per human, but reducing the number of humans in an orderly and a respectful way.
I guess my thoughts are yes. I think our consumption per unit and the amount of people on the planet is a problem, is an issue, and so that I think that's a very important point on our metal use going forward. A very important point.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Hey man, this is maybe okay. Perhaps it's just a semantic thing, but there might be something interesting to come out of it. You said that orthodox economists deny the existence of scarcity in general, which they sort of deny that the finiteness of resources is a big deal. But I would argue that they invented general scarcity in that before a few centuries ago, scarcity was like a temporary shortage for people, and the idea that things are always scarce relative to unlimited desires was sort of invented by the philosophers of political economy.
Yeah.
And
I guess, I guess my main point for saying that was that it is talking about substitutability and the technological, our orthodox economists assuming that we'll just use something up and then switch, our technological advancements will switch over to something else. But if we keep doing that, we'll end up with a complete wasteland planet. That's what I was trying to say with that statement.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool. All right, and then last but not least, we have Meredith Niles, whose bio is not loading. Hold on one second. Aha, okay. Meredith is an assistant professor and faculty with the UVM Food Systems program. She examines food systems, sustainability, and policy with a focus on food security and climate change and farmer behavior and policy perceptions. Meredith thrives conducting applied research that can help bring together diverse stakeholders, whether on a farm or working with policymakers to help solve pressing problems facing our world's food system. Meredith is a passionate advocate for open access research to make research more publicly available to maximize the potential of science and its benefits for society.
Great, thanks, Emma. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes, all right, I'll assume that's a go. Well, thank you for inviting me. I thought I would share a little bit today about some of the work I've done over the past several years with farmers. And I actually took out the climate part of my title, so this is just called Fostering Stewardship Among Farmers. So just to briefly, as others have done, how do we define steward? So this is also the Merriam-Webster definition of steward. And I think it's really interesting that in that definition, they specifically talk about stewardship of natural resources as one particular example of stewardship. And so one thing I've been thinking about as I've learned more about the Ecozoic and the work that's happening at McGill and UVM is, if we want to get to an Ecozoic, how do we actually get there? And my particular interest in thinking about these issues is mostly on food systems, as Emma noted. And so I think these are really interesting problems in part because they're inherently complex and interconnected. There's so many varying drivers and actors and outcomes within our food system. And looking at the entire food system as opposed to just one piece of it, I think is really important to consider feedbacks and relationships between different aspects of our food system. That being said, today I am going to hone in on sort of this production side of the topic. And in particular on some of my work that I've done with farmers, as I noted. This is a farmer I've worked with in New Zealand where I've done a lot of my research, sheep and beef farmers. So I'd be happy to chat about New Zealand at some point with anybody. There was some conversation about that earlier. And ultimately the questions I'm seeking on answering as it relates to agriculture and farmers is what influences human behavior? And in particular, as we think about shifting towards new norms around environmental sustainability and stewardship, what are the factors that we know could influence people's behaviors around some of these key challenges? And there's a wide variety of literature around pro-environmental norms and behaviors, less so working with farmers and in the food system, but these are some of the sort of general ideas that are brought up around why people do certain things or why they don't do certain things. So there's definitely some theories out there about knowledge deficit, meaning that people just don't know enough about an environmental problem. And if they did know, they would do something about it. Attitudes and beliefs and values are really important. Social networks, subjective norms, meaning how others in your community perceive you or you perceive what they're doing, and then perceived capacity. And today I'm just going to give you a snapshot, hopefully very quickly, of three studies that I've worked on over my time frame, focused on farmers in California and then also in New Zealand. And one of the key things I want to sort of take away here for all of you is I don't think we have a knowledge problem per se. In my experience working with farmers, farmers actually know a lot about environmental challenges. And I would also posit that farmers see themselves actually as stewards. And so these are some quotes from research that I've published in different contexts. These are mostly from California farmers, but some of them are from New Zealand farmers. And I won't read all of these, but you can see that, for example, farmers acknowledge that groundwater pumping is a tragedy of the commons, for example. They describe themselves as environmentalists in many ways. They describe themselves as resource managers. And they think that they're perceived by urban people in ways that maybe aren't necessarily fair. And so one thing I think is interesting to think about is that farmers already see themselves as environmental stewards, and how might we think about that framing in conversations with people in agriculture to possibly shift towards new strategies for environmental outcomes. So briefly, three snapshots of things that I've found are really interesting and might be driving different kinds of behaviors at the farm level. A study that we did a few years ago, actually about 5 years now, we really were trying to understand, a lot of my work has been with farmers and climate change, and this is a pretty typical hypothesis for a farmer experiencing something in climate change like a drought, which might influence their climate change belief and concerns and their potential adaptation or mitigation behaviors, or their potential to support climate policies. And this was work that we had published in 2012. But I kept hearing a lot from farmers about policy and regulations. And so one thing that we looked at further here was to really understand, well, how do farmers perceive environmental policies? And is it possible that actually the way they experience the policy process and their level of engagement in that process, or the way they feel informed or engaged in that, might actually have a bigger impact on their climate change beliefs than even maybe their drought experiences or their climate experiences. And so that was one of the things that we found from this work that we published in Global Environmental Change, was that maybe it's not just sort of the biophysical climate experiences that people have that could be shaping their concern for environmental problems, but actually the way in which they experience policies themselves could also be really important for driving their perception. So that has a lot of implications for policy design and consultation with farmers. Another study that we looked at, farmers' adoption of mitigation and adaptation practices, and this was in New Zealand. And we wanted to understand both sort of what people said they were going to do, but then what they actually did. And we looked at a lot of different factors here, everything from their climate change belief to their perception of climate risks and their views on climate policies, and then their farm and farmer characteristics and profit motivations. And what we found was actually that it was perceived capacity that had the most consistent effect on both intention to want to adopt adaptation and mitigation behaviors, as well as then actually going through and doing it. It was only perceived capacity that really mattered across all of these contexts. Unfortunately, what we also found was that only about 50% of farmers felt that they had that perceived capacity to be able to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And then a final study that I thought I'd share briefly that is still ongoing, and we're hopefully going to submit this first article for publication in the next couple of weeks, is work I'm doing currently in California with farmers around the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and that's its implementation. And we've done a survey of farmers in the Central Valley, and we found some really interesting results that we've dug into. And what we found was actually farmers recognize that groundwater extraction is a problem. About 80% of farmers we surveyed recognized that groundwater extraction could result in undesirable results, and they were concerned about that. Most of them also thought that this was either happening now or would happen in the future. And actually more than 70% of them felt that they could achieve groundwater sustainability. They did have the perceived capacity in order to deal with this new regulation, which is really interesting from a behavior standpoint, because all of those things that you might think predict why someone would or wouldn't change their behavior on farm. So they're concerned for the issue, belief it's a problem, it's happening in the near future, and I can actually do something about it, suggests that farmers should all be adopting more sustainable water policies. But we also then asked some really interesting questions about perceived, about subjective norms. And what we found was that when we asked farmers individually if they thought this policy was necessary to achieve groundwater sustainability, the majority of them agreed with that statement, both in California and also in Yolo County, a specific place that we were working. But when we asked them if they thought other farmers thought SGMA was necessary, we saw a real drop off in the percent of farmers that agreed with that statement, both in California and in Yolo County. And this is really important from a subjective norms perspective, because it suggests that people themselves individually might think, well, I think this is a problem, we should probably do something about it, but none of my neighbors think this is a problem. None of the other farmers think it's a problem. So therefore, I guess I don't have to do anything either. And so this is a really important conclusion in terms of subjective norms. And it has a lot of policy implications around how do you create conversations with farmers where they can talk to each other about their concerns and be upfront about what they are experiencing. And I'll just add one more thing on this, which is that we looked at the relationship of this to different kinds of support for policies, either regulatory, moratorium, and fee-driven policies versus incentive-based policies. And it was these subjective norms that were really important for farmers to get ahead and support some of the more regulatory policies that might be necessary for groundwater management, such as moratoriums on pumping or groundwater replenishment fees, for example. So just to conclude, I know I did a snapshot of a bunch of different things, but I wanted to get you thinking about if we're moving towards the ecozoic and we want to try to change human behavior, how do we do that, and how do we work with farmers, and what are some of the things that we found matter beyond just give them more information or tell them climate change is a problem. And I think it is helpful to think that farmers themselves often describe themselves as stewards, and using that as a starting place to understand what that might look like is really helpful. I think it's critical that we think about how we involve communities in policy processes so that those policies get created and don't have long-term negative impacts on people's perception that could then drive their inability to believe that another environmental problem is an issue down the road. And then thinking through things like networks and social networks and fostering perceived capacity among farmers, I think is also really helpful to move towards some of these other kinds of ideas. So I'll take questions with that, and just wanted to acknowledge all of the colleagues that I've worked with on some of this research.
I've got a question. Take it. So you mentioned that the farmers have inaccurate perceptions of their colleagues or fellow farmers' views. Do you report back your findings to them to help mitigate that disparity?
Yeah, I'm actually flying to California on Friday and giving a talk to the Farm Bureau next week. I've given this presentation, a longer version of it, to the California Farm Bureau, but I'll be directly reporting back to the local county Farm Bureau and then working with them on a presentation of the results back out to the farming community there. Yeah.
Super awesome. You gave a lot of lists of factors in people's behavior. We've got a question whether you've considered worldview.
I'm sorry, say that again?
If you've considered worldview, if that plays into your analysis.
Could you say a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Ooh,
Worldview.
well, it wasn't my question. So the question was, what about worldview? Doesn't that affect human behavior also?
Well, certainly I think the way that people see themselves within society more broadly, their own contributions to it or not, I think definitely plays into this. I mean, one thing that we hear pretty consistently working with farmers, and I think this depends very much on your worldview, is that they feel very proud to grow food for people. And I think that deeply affects their worldview and the way that they see themselves within both the environment, but also their contribution to society. And so I think from that perspective, like how farmers see themselves contributing to society is something that consistently I hear is very important to a lot of them.
Did someone have a question?
Next question. Yeah, hi, thank you very much for that presentation. I was wondering, it's Peter Brown from McGill. I was wondering how your analysis would be different if instead of the things where you talked about human motivation on the beginning slide, if you put the 7 deadly sins in there. That's a more accurate description of how we actually act.
Yeah, great, great point. In terms of starting from a different assumption place about sort of what we, I hear you. I understand what you're saying there. I mean, I think I use the word stewardship in part because I'm really fascinated in the idea that farmers consistently in many of the places I've worked always use that term. And I think that's really interesting. And I think it's a really traditional, like conventional farmers who ultimately, you know, we would like to see shift towards different kinds of practices. And I think I've always found it a really interesting and useful way to start conversations, quite often hard conversations with farmers about things like climate change when they might not believe in climate change. But I've always found that stewardship term to be a useful starting place in conversations with farmers themselves. And that's
Aldo Leopold's view of
Why I described this talk in that way.
Am I on now?
You're on.
Aldo Leopold's view of stewardship seemed to be that it was highly desirable and everybody was for it, provided the government would pay for it.
You know, what's really interesting about that is actually we have a lot of data about whether or not farmers want to participate in government incentive programs. And it's not overwhelming. We find that, you know, the most common one in the United States, at least, is EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. But in fact, there's a lot of farmers out there who want nothing to do with government incentive programs, actually, which is interesting to think about, because if you're going to change behavior and economics or incentive programs aren't part of the option, how do you do it?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Meredith.
Thank you.